Ladies and gentlemen, all very important people in this room here, when I received Dennis's invitation, he said to me, don't just give a UNEP speech, give a speech that we jointly presented actually at the World Economic Forum in Davos when we together went and tried to capture the imagination of a global business and political elite as to why biodiversity, ecosystems, agroforestry, a systems perspective on food security and agriculture matters to the world more today than ever before. And so I'm a little bit in awe, in a sense, having a presentation at this moment, knowing who is in this room here. So let me, for a moment, clarify two things. A certain amount of credentials I can bring to the table, because I am actually somebody who, until he was 18 years old, grew up on a farm. My father is a plant breeder, and the earliest photos I have of my childhood in Brazil is engaged in plant breeding with my father, because he was a plant breeder and that was his job at the time. So agriculture in many ways is, let's say, the origin of where I drew some of my interest in looking at the broader issue of sustainability and sustainable development. Secondly, I will not give you a UNEP speech, but what I would like to give you this morning is a sense of where I would like the environmental discourse to intersect far more with the future of agriculture, sustainability, food security, and livelihoods. I said to Bruce as I walked in, and Bruce actually knows me when I was a young economist at IUCN in Harare, we go back a long way, that throughout the last 20 to 30 years, the environmental sustainability agenda and the agriculture, food security agenda and communities have had a very strange relationship. On the one hand, they are bound by virtue of reality, the subject, the resources they deal with, to interact. And yet, they live in a state of constant latent animosity and eternal hope. I put it in this way because if you look at the future of this challenge of sustainable development, agriculture is, from the perspective of an institution and an agenda such as UNEP's, absolutely central. And yet, if you look over the years at how little systemic, sustained, and fundamentally jointly planned interaction we've had between these two worlds, it is stunning how little we have actually succeeded in doing that. And it is one of the great benefits of being here in Nairobi that we have this proximity with ICRAF, with ILRI, with now AGRA being based here, with many of the UN agencies that together with UNEP have their home here in Nairobi. And the formation of the Nairobi Forum, to me, is an expression, I think, of an increasingly shared sense of urgency to create more intelligent fora and a more intelligent discourse. The reason why I am so interested in the issue of agriculture is that I think it is one of the areas in our global economy that will either determine whether the world can reinvent itself, literally reinvent itself in terms of the development paradigms, the development pathways over the next, not 100 years, but literally the next 2 decades, or continue down a pathway which in the history of modern agriculture, and by this I mean modern agriculture not in the sense of the small-scale rural household farming system somewhere in Africa or in Latin America, or maybe even in parts of Europe, but the modern industrialized agricultural paradigm where the maximization of production has really been the guiding principle for much of agricultural research, agricultural commercialization, and also agricultural policy. We have been driven by the paradigm of having to feed an ever-growing world, and we have also been fascinated by the opportunities of science and technology as they have presented themselves to us over the last 100 years in particular, that we can go down a pathway of continuing to increase food production, increase it in the sense that we have, I think it is over the last 40 years, managed to double food production. And yes, we do have another 3 billion hungry consumers coming onto the marketplace in addition to the 6.5 we already have on this planet today. So yes, we do have a major challenge. How are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to maintain the productive capacity of the very asset on which we rely for production of food? And above all, how are we going to ensure that agriculture begins to break out of its own compartmentalized box in the global economic and public policy framework? Because that is one of the fascinating phenomena of agriculture, also in the political arena. If you look at a region such as Europe and you look at the evolution of the common agriculture policy, if you try and bring a political scientist to understand how a small group of farmers can bring a nation to a standstill over a question of a subsidy for a particular crop, how in the context of Europe's and the European Union's evolution, agriculture has almost had a stranglehold on the budget of a community of nations that have so many other issues to deal with. If you also look at how agriculture today in the context of climate change is beginning to become an intensely political issue. Look at the carbon footprint, for instance, and the debates that directly affect the future of the agricultural sector of Kenya. Is growing vegetables and flowers and flying them to Europe an intelligent way of using the global marketplace? Yes, it is right now for Kenya, and perhaps it will into the future. But what is it that underlines the policies that lead one country to invest in that sector, that makes a global marketplace look for these kinds of supply chains? All of this is part of rethinking agriculture not as a narrow sector, but rather as a platform upon which the world would either learn, because I think we are still at the learning stage, and succeed to operate in a collaborative effort, not defined only by the notions of comparative advantage in the global marketplace, but rather in the collective responsibility to ensure that 50 years from now we can produce the food to feed 9 billion people across the planet and not just in some corners of the planet. From a perspective of looking at agriculture today, and in the presentations that you've already had just now, I feel absolutely in a position to align myself. The terms systems, transformative, fragmented were just some of the terms that you used, Carlos, Thomas, also Rick just now, and Dennis, in describing one of the challenges. I want to go a bit further and say to you that I think agriculture is facing, in the sense of modern agriculture, an absolute midlife crisis. And I put it in those terms because I was stunned, and I will put this in a very provocative sense, at the reaction of the agricultural establishment to the food price crisis of 2 to 3 years ago. Here we were in the year 2008, 2009, where the world suddenly confronted with 100 million plus being priced out of the basic food market, with irrational price fluctuations taking place in a global marketplace that, in some ways, for those who can go to the supermarket and pay perhaps 5% more, it would not matter. But literally to hundreds of millions of people, it brought a fundamental challenge to their livelihoods. That perspective alone made me think, well, what is it that we are going to do in the coming years to not have a global community being held hostage to this kind of scenario? And the response, initially at least, of what I would call the world of agriculture was stunning to me in its lack of imagination, because much of the response that was articulated was simply more of the same that had brought us to precisely the point where we are today. Yes, we have a tremendous record in having increased agricultural production. But, ladies and gentlemen, not productivity. Let's start with that. Agricultural productivity in a global indices context is actually declining. But if you look at the balance sheet of agriculture, and I particularly refer here to modern agriculture, then the balance sheet is an extraordinary one. It is almost a business operation that is working towards its own demise. Because what is happening with the basic laws of the market that are driving farmers to engage in certain production systems, the commercial offerings that are being made to farmers in this marketplace, are almost forcing farmers to mine the very capital on which they rely for their production. We are reducing soil fertility. We are increasing the degradation of ecosystems. We are continuing to bet on a resource that already demands 80 to 85% of its global available resource, which is water. We are increasing the use of fertilizers as if that is the panacea for continued expansion of agricultural production, both from an environmental sustainability context as much as from a farmer's economic perspective, particularly if you want to focus on the smallholder. This in itself cannot be the answer alone. And let me be very clear. We always talk, particularly in these global meetings and with a global perspective about agriculture as if it is the same everywhere. Clearly it isn't. And let me be very clear, I am not somebody who would argue that a continent like Africa would not, in its strategy for developing agriculture, also have a component to increase the use of modern inputs. Absolutely. But if the premise for the future of agricultural development in Africa is solely resting on the notion of more seeds, more fertilizer, more irrigation, then I think it is a pathway that is leading Africa down precisely the same direction that has led to tragedy and in growing footprints in terms of cost to society, to farmers, and to food security that we have begun to see in other parts of the world. The balance sheet of modern agriculture is fascinating from its ability to expand production. It is disconcerting from its inability to understand how it is mining the resource, the natural capital of this planet. And whether it is the simple notion of the dust bowls or the drying up of major water reservoirs, the drying out and destruction of 50% of the world's wetlands in the last 100 years, very often in the name of agricultural frontiers, putting land into productive use, as we called it, not understanding how much use and how much service we were taking out of our economy by doing so, are just a few examples, and you are familiar with them. You may not share my aggregated view of what the cumulative impact of these decisions are, but ladies and gentlemen, please do look at some of these indices that you work with every day. The pathway of agriculture of the 20th century, expanded and magnified in the 21st century, is a road into disaster. And that is why the discussions that are happening today, for example, at the forum in Montpellier, but also in CGIAR, in many national ministries of agriculture, in the scientific and research community, are so important. I begin with that view because I also want to appeal to you that as we look at climate change, we should understand climate change is not just the contemporary focus of a world that has suddenly learned that it has overlooked something, ignored it for far too long, and now has to, in a sense, scramble in order to catch up with its ability to deal with this phenomenon of global warming. And I don't want to waste your time because, first of all, you know the story of global warming, its implications for agriculture, and you will spend time on it in the coming days. What I would like to focus on is to understand climate change as being also that transformative challenge to your community, to our ambition to make food security and agriculture part of the solution, rather than leaving it as part of the problem that has, with other factors, brought the world to some of the very stark realities we face today. We published a report last year, partly in response to what we sensed was a very narrow response to the global food price crisis, what's called the environmental food crisis. It was essentially trying to broaden the lens in looking at the responses that were necessary. And in there, we also tried to draw the attention to the fact that depending on how you frame the problem, all the solutions that will then be proposed are almost predefined. And I think it is at this point that particularly in your community and with this initiative and with this ambition that you have now set out in the CGIAR and with the partnerships that you have, that you must put your focus on. We have to change the lens with which we look at the problem. Because if you simply follow the same pathway as we have done the last 30 or 40 years, you will not produce transformative solutions. You will provide amplifications of existing patterns. You will reproduce research directions that, yes, we can continue to research, for another 100 years. And yes, we will make incremental progress, but we will not begin to touch on transformative solutions. By all means, let's have another green revolution. But as I have always said, then let's give it at least a capital G this time. Because I'm not, again, in the community of people who demonize the green revolution of the 60s and 70s. I think it bought us time, but it also blinded us. And I think it is this mistake that we cannot commit again. And when we talk about a green revolution, we have to begin to translate the rhetoric, which is now part of the research community increasingly and also of the policy community, that we adopt a systems perspective, that we look at working with nature rather than against it or bypassing nature in agriculture, that we also look at solutions that allow us to increase food production not only by drawing on technology and chemical inputs, by intensification that ultimately either will mine the very substance on which we rely, that wonderful layer of about 1 meter of topsoil, on which every day we commit some extraordinarily ignorant things, and therefore make that very 1 meter of topsoil, on which largely everything we eat and relies on in turn, we cannot continue to promote a system of production that will make the next generation either have to pay twice as much to get even the same amount of return from that crop, or even worse, to lose larger and larger tracts of land on this planet on which we can grow food. Working with nature rather than against it is a challenge to a great deal of 20th century agriculture. The report that came out 3 years ago about technology and agriculture, many of you will remember it, got stuck in the debate about GMOs, and it is one of the tragedies that singular issues that are really not the defining element of the future of agriculture became the focus of a much more important debate about how to look at the future of agricultural production and food security. It is also interesting that, yet again, a commercially defined conflict of interest, which at the moment explains perhaps less than 1 or 2% of global agricultural production, led to a division that left this report, in a sense, attacked by some central players in the community of agriculture in the larger sense. Therefore, understanding also the economics of agriculture, the markets, and therefore the policies that are shaped by the interests in that marketplace have to be part of what you factor into your research. Because 260 or 280 billion agricultural subsidies every year, provided very often in a very political and constituency context, rather than driven by either a strategic or scientifically determined agenda, is also an area that you should have in your focus as an area to influence. I would like to perhaps take a few minutes to show to you what I believe are just some illustrations of how the frontier of research in the context of climate change, but also beyond it, can look at some new pathways in the future. And let me emphasize, they are neither a top-ranking list, they are simply a few examples that have fascinated me because they demonstrate in many ways what I mean by changing the lens with which we look at some of the challenges. Clearly, increasing yields and productivity in agriculture is paramount because we know that in 40 years' time we will have 2.5 to 3 billion more people to feed. So this is not some luxury question. But if you look at the evolution of agriculture over the last 100, you could even say perhaps 1,000 years, it has been driven by a paradigm of horizontal expansion and with it a degree of intensification. Whether it is the slash and burn approach or whether it is the kind of moving on as, Dust Bowl phenomena emerge or parts of the water supply chains that have allowed agriculture to thrive, take Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin, have changed over time. Agriculture has had to move on, always to new frontiers. And now we're again talking about, well, maybe opening up Africa to feed the world is important, or going to the Ukraine and Kazakhstan are the sort of other parts of the world where, in the food price crisis suddenly emerge as these somehow miraculously open terrains for growing a lot more grains. That paradigm of horizontal expansion is both deceptive and ultimately self-defeating because you only have a little bit left for horizontal expansion, and quite frankly, the lessons of the last 30 to 40 years in terms of loss of ecosystem services, biodiversity, the competition for water, even with the emergence of issues such as biofuels, clearly shows to us that we have to come up with more intelligent answers. Now, the argument for fertilizers, for hybrid seeds, for GMOs, is very much based on the notion that we have to intensify production on the land that we have. Yes, it is one pathway, and certainly it is going to be part of the answer. But I would also like to draw your attention to a question, have we actually thought about, if you want, a vertical expansion and intensification of agriculture? Why is it that in this day and age, we have not had more research on the viability, productivity, and potential for plant breeding with perennial food crops? It is to me stunning, and I have asked this question now for over a year and a half because it is a question that my own father presented to me after 80 years of looking at agriculture and saying, we have to look at a different way in which we're going to intensify production. And in the context of climate change, it is a very interesting one, and it touches on soil fertility, on moisture retention, on the amount of effort that you have to invest to produce. But above all, it has to do with trying to protect that very layer of soil on which we rely. Why is it that in the year 2010, there is virtually no commercial and just very little academic research on that frontier of perennial food crops? We know that perennial crops work, and we are in the center of one of the think tanks about, not just think tanks, research centers, when it comes to agroforestry. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on why this is worthwhile. I think you will understand very quickly why thinking about perennial food crops would make a lot of sense. You would be able to tap nutrient reserves below that very volatile layer that we have now. You would reduce the disturbance to the soil structure, to the capacity of soils to regenerate, to the whole biodiversity and microorganisms that essentially thrive but have also been diminished by modern agriculture to a great degree. Well, some of the answers are that, it's not very interesting for a commercial seed company to invest in perennial food crops. The annual hybrid seed cycle is an intensive market mechanism, an intense commercial market. The question also is if labor is going to increasingly become a constraint in the north, and also, let's be honest, it's not as if people in the south are just sitting around to grow food crops and till land for virtually no return. It is the measure of last desperation, if you want, but it's certainly not the vision of a family household in Africa to go with a hoe and continue doing this for the next 100 years. So here is one question: why are we not doing more research? And, again, talking about carbon footprints, if you add up the amount of diesel and energy that is expended on dealing with modern agricultural land use methods, imagine for a moment if you could have a crop that essentially for a cycle of 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 years would not require you to plow, to till, to seed. Extraordinary implications for the footprint of agriculture, which, ladies and gentlemen, with or without Carlos Ceres's footprint, if I may just borrow it for a moment, will lie somewhere in the range of 18 to 30% of carbon emissions on this planet. And herein lies my second frontier, if you want. Yes, climate change at the moment is perceived as a major threat to agriculture and to food security, and it is in absolute terms, and it will increasingly become obvious in how many different respects that is true, as research and the IPCC continue to assemble the knowledge that we are just beginning to really document on a global basis. But climate change is also an opportunity for agriculture. First of all, in being part of the answer to mitigation. That footprint of somewhere between 80 to 30%, if you include all aspects of agriculture, is a significant frontier for society to incentivize and to support in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So notions that look at agricultural research and the frontiers in terms of technology, in terms of farming systems, that make the mitigation factor part of its future role in a marketplace of both public and commercial markets is fundamental. And it is not just research about a crop or a farming system, it is also research about the right policy environment within which agriculture and farmers can be incentivized. We are at the moment working with a number, and probably a number of your institutions are partners in this, on the question of carbon farming. We have broken through, if you want, the historical barrier of looking at ecosystem services in the climate negotiations by establishing the foundations of what is called the RED, the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation policy framework. And perhaps one of the outcomes of Copenhagen that will be further reaffirmed in Cancun is that final jump into accepting that, yes, nations can pay each other for ecosystem services, in this case, carbon sequestration. But what is fascinating about RED is that it demonstrates precisely where I think the frontier has to move to, and that is looking at co-benefits, looking at systems rather than at problems in isolation. Because ironically, climate change is the biggest economic steroid injection into realizing biodiversity and ecosystem issues also that we have seen for the last 50 years in public policy. Because if the RED market, so to speak, succeeds, it will provide a tremendous incentive always assuming within the right policy context, with the right directions also, to also give countries an incentive to maintain forest ecosystems, with it biodiversity, with it also many of the services that society draws from them. Well, carbon farming is not that far off. If we can demonstrate with the right metrics and indices that the practice of one farming system or technique over another, one production system over another, has a net benefit in terms of carbon emissions, what stands in the way 5 to 10 years from now to also be able to pay farmers for that service that they render to society by reducing their contribution to a global problem? And we are not that far off from being able to get these indicators and also measurements and matrices into place. And it is one of these global projects that UNEP is working with a number of your institutions right now to assess where are we on that frontier. Similarly, if we can have households and farming systems practice agriculture that can even contribute to carbon capture, agroforestry. And here the combination of the wonderful fertilizer tree that Dennis has become almost a prophet for, and I'm one of his greatest fans for having opened our eyes, not just in theory, but on a scalable level for a whole continent, to look at the combination of soil fertility, of fertilizer or enhancing the productivity of the soil, combining it also with bringing trees back into farming systems, which, for a long time was considered a disturbance to an optimal modern farming production system. It is when we start looking at the co-benefits and the win-wins, that is when we change both the viability of a more sustainable agricultural system in terms of both the farmer, him or herself, and the broader policy context. We also need to, and I come back here a little bit to my broader theme at the beginning when I talk about a green revolution with a capital G, we need to also put that in the context of rebalancing the supply chain of a farm. Why is it that the story of farming over the 20th century was increasingly one of making an almost self-reliant farmer increasingly dependent on others and increasingly commercially dependent and cash dependent on a supply chain of inputs? A farming system doesn't have to be autonomous, but this idea that somehow a farmer will only succeed if they now buy their seeds from Cargill and buy their fertilizer from a global company, if they only supply to a European market and can export, is in itself, as a singular paradigm, a fallacy. The fertilizer tree is about enabling a farmer to enhance the fertility and productivity of their farmland without having to become dependent on a commercial patent held in another country, and in terms of the commercial marketplace in the global economy, being almost out of reach for many farmers. At the same time, the fertilizer tree also helps us to deal with a major environmental problem, which is the pollution that we now face and the environmental destruction from the footprint of modern commercial agriculture. Nitrous oxide has a global warming factor that is 310 times stronger than carbon dioxide. Nitrogen is creating dead zones in our oceans to an ever-growing degree because of the deoxygenation that is taking place. So look at, for a moment, the notion of the farmer with his or her supply chain and look at the post-farm consequences of that intensification model. Bring that together with a climate agenda, bring that together with a maintaining ecosystem and farming productivity agenda, and you suddenly have a completely different economic rationale for changing agricultural policy. It is on these frontiers that have often, as you, I think, said, Thomas, been compartmentalized and siloed, that I think the answer lies for how we will feed 9 billion people in a way that begins to make agriculture part of the solution rather than exacerbating its role as a contributor to the problem, not just in terms of carbon emissions and climate change and the vulnerabilities associated with it, but in terms of ensuring that the natural capital on this planet, which for so long has remained an invisible economic factor in our GDP and our development calculations, will finally be recognized as what it is. And that will open the door for farmers to not simply be driven either into ruin or into undermining their own future by producing under a model that forces them to be miners rather than custodians of a resource. And this is not somehow a religious shift in paradigm. We do already, in many parts of the world, reward farmers for providing services to society. Not the crude form of keeping them alive with subsidies as we saw in the European Union, but yes, paying them for landscape management services. Farmers and farming systems in the future are not simply about producing food. They are, in a sense, about rewarding people who will be custodians of the natural capital of our planet, in which food security and food production is just one service that they provide. And that is why the future of farming is not just about production. It is about services rendered to a society which in turn are captured in an economic model. And I think here, the CGIAR and also the linkage between a driver for rethinking the whole agenda of agriculture, such as climate change, is a tremendous opportunity. And believe me, I do not want to diminish the threat of climate change and global warming. It is my daily job to try and draw the world's attention to how little time we have left to even exercise choices in what we make. But I think for the agricultural community, for the food security debates that we now have in the world, and if you want, for the future of farming, this systems perspective, the notion of co-benefits, the shifting from another green revolution that is simply based on model of intensification, technology, and inputs from outside the farming household, to a green revolution with a capital G, and I won't repeat the elements, and I've just touched upon some of them. I think you have an extraordinary opportunity to shift a paradigm, to be transformative, because it is interesting, the word transformative has emerged in our, let's say, broader development community in the last few years as never before, because we do feel we are at a point of inflection and also choice-making that requires transformative solutions. I hope that in the way that you can make this and also the ultimate, the mega programs that are emerging, and to make CGIAR also more than the constituent parts of it. It's the same challenge we face within the United Nations system, for that matter. It is one of my core ambitions, if you want, as Executive Director of UNEP, to make UNEP, in a sense, a partner with every other UN organization, be it on the agricultural frontier, be it in terms of food security, be it in terms of science and climate change. Because what the environmental perspective offers in terms of both a vision for the future of development, but also a reality check in terms of the status quo, is that the natural capital of this planet, contrary to what many believed at the end of the 20th century, was becoming increasingly redundant because technology, science, and all the other frontiers we had pushed would almost enable us to delink ourselves from the constraints on this planet, have been proven brutally wrong. Because at the pinnacle of a world that was richer than ever before, technologically more advanced than ever before, bang, came global warming. A substance that we didn't even think about, we don't smell, we don't see, has suddenly thrown the future of our economic model into turmoil. These are the unknown unknowns, perhaps, that Rumsfeld referred to, or the black swan, as is sometimes it is also referred to, as those scenarios in which we, for far too long, did not look ahead and therefore got taken by surprise. And the volcano is just a very small illustration of what surprises can do to us. And I just end by saying that as far as I'm concerned, maybe a little volcano from time to time is not a bad thing, because it can give us a bit of pause and food for thought. And I noticed that you put Nairobi, May 2010. So have you already factored into this that you may all be here for a lot longer? Because the volcano is spewing in. But I was just giving Dennis the example that for UNEP, actually the volcano turned out to be quite a good thing, because we had set ourselves a target. We are now a climate carbon neutral institution in the UN. We measure our entire footprint. And we have set ourselves what sounds a very unambitious goal, but in a growing organization, reducing in absolute terms your emissions by 3% scared many of us. The volcano did the whole job. In just 1 week of ceasing to travel, we managed to achieve our 2010 target. So I hope some of these thoughts will trigger not new thinking, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't, in a sense, looking to those directions already. What I would like to offer to you and, in a sense, convey to you also is a growing sense within the United Nations that these are the directions in which we have to work. I would like to offer UNEP's wholehearted support to the initiative that you have taken with climate change, agriculture, and food security, and to look also in the context of the work that you will be doing in the coming years of how we can contribute and in turn, and much more importantly, become, if you want, a platform upon which some of this new thinking will rapidly move into many different capitals and communities around the world. Thank you.